So this chapter starts off coming back to All Might encountering All for One. Previously, we've been with Toga taking on Uraraka, so the outside world has kind of been cut off for the most part, and we don't know what had happened with All Might and All for One. We also still currently don't know if Toga is alive or not, but probably not, just going to guess, but there's a chance she could be alive. But now that that battle's over, we're coming back to All Might taking on All for One, and we saw previously that All Might's briefcase and car was like disassembling, and it looked like it was becoming some kind of armor or something, and we had speculated that All Might was going to have some kind of like Hulkbuster armor or something, and this chapter is confirming that yeah, he does have some kind of like armor Hulkbuster. It's actually called Armored All Might, and it gives him like this mech suit that's actually pretty powerful and looks similar to how All Might looked in his prime, but like in robotic form. And I do have some issues with this, and it goes back to what I talked about previously about how, first of all, if they're able to make something this powerful, because as we'll see in this chapter, it is pretty powerful, like he's able to fight against All for One using this, then why didn't they make multiple of these suits? Like give them to multiple people who could use them, like All Might, who is nerfed at this point, unable to use his quirk, but just weakened overall, like in a weakened state, even for just a base level human. If they could have given technology like this to other capable individuals with good quirks or quirks that could complement this technology, they would have had a much better time taking on the villains at this point. Like they wasted a lot of their manpower and utilities making that underground elevator, which ultimately just led to nothing, when they could have been making multiple of these like All Might Hulkbuster suits that everyone could be using that's comparable in power to a young All for One, essentially, right? I mean, I'm not saying that that guarantees victory, but I think they would have been doing much better than what they are now than just singularly giving this to All Might. But that's neither here nor there. It also goes into, I thought that maybe a better route to go with All Might having his power back again for one last time would have been All Might going down similar to how All for One is going down right now. And that's by Eri using her quirk to rewind All Might to a time when he was powerful, because that's what's currently going on with All for One. Yujiko was able to reverse engineer the quirk destroying bullets that Shigaraki was able to steal from Overhaul, which he was able to produce from experimenting on Eri's quirk. And Yujiko was able to make like the synthetic version of it that, I don't know, was like a capsule or something. We don't see how All for One uses it, but whatever Yujiko was able to do, it produced this effect of Eri's quirk that rewinds All for One perpetually. So he will eventually rewind to nothingness, but it's kind of like a slow drip kind of thing that makes him younger slowly. So right now we see All for One in like his 20s, I don't know, his college years possibly, taking on All for One. But he's been rewinding back from like being over 100 years old at this point, I guess. And we also see that his quirk factor has been altering as well, since he's been able to access quirks and powers that he hasn't been able to use before. So I thought it would be cool if Eri used the same thing on All Might, except it was just from Eri herself, rather than like a backdoor reverse engineered version of it that Yujiko is using. And then her using that ability on All Might could revert him back to a time to when he was young enough, and that his quirk factor with One for All was restored enough as to where he was powerful. I don't know, take him back to like a time during the beginning of the Two Heroes movie, like the first My Hero movie, or just when he was actually fighting All for One the first time, like 7 years ago, or take him back 8 years ago. I don't know, just take him to a very powerful point. Or just have him lead the same path as All for One, like rewinding to nothingness, so that they both battle each other until they're nothing, and that's the ticking clock for both of them. But we're getting Hulkbuster All Might in the end here, which is, you know, better than nothing. I mean, he is still strong enough to fight against All for One in seemingly their final battle here, I guess, right? I mean, this is the end of the series, so I guess this is going to be All Might's final task, to stop All for One from reaching Shigaraki and Izuku. Because the ticking clock that All For One has here, you know, rewinding slowly, he needs to get to where Shigaraki's body is, you know, that's currently fighting against Izuku, so that he can merge with his original All For One body that's rewinding, so that he has full control over like the perfected Shigaraki body and the original All For One quirk, the perfected version, so that he can become like the all-powerful All For One at that point. Like he has the vessel, like the hardware that can finally accommodate his software, like his quirk. But now All Might is here attempting to stop him from reaching that, and this might be All Might's final moment in the series. Like stopping All For One from reaching Shigaraki. And it also goes back into the beginning of this chapter, when we see All Might remembering what Night Eye had told him, where he says like, continue down this path and you will encounter a villain. What awaits you then is an unspeakably gruesome death. And this has been going on for years, of course. And we thought, oh, this also meant that All Might is going to probably be killed by Shigaraki, like his DK quirk fits this description, right? But now it turns out that maybe it's not Shigaraki, and maybe it's just the young version of All For One, actually, in the future that is going to kill All Might. And I'm not really sure. Maybe it's like a double fake out. And now maybe this whole time, all of these red flags have just been throwing us off, and All Might is actually going to survive here ultimately. I'm not really sure. Mainly because Izuku was able to beat Night Eye's prediction, like his foresight ability from his quirk. So it's possible that All Might could do the same and ultimately wind up living here. But, you know, it also could mean that All Might might ultimately die here as well, and he's just killed by All For One in a big tragic moment, and then All For One eventually gets to Shigaraki, but I just don't feel like it's going to go down that smoothly. Like, I think by the end, it has to come to the point of Shigaraki rejecting All For One more than he has already. And I also think it has to be revealed that All For One gave Shigaraki the DK quirk. Like, that still hasn't been revealed yet, so there still has to be that moment, and I'm not sure how that timeline ties into what's going on here, because we also find out that this sequence is happening 20 minutes before the Toga and Twice army had faded. So what we were coming off of previously, this is like a look into the past. So this definitely concluded in that time span. But anyway, we see All Might going after All For One. And we're seeing the power of this suit here, where there's like multiple of these like shield-like projectiles that come out and surround All Might, and he's able to launch himself at All For One, just like a super-powered individual would. Like, this is like better than a quirk. The way that they're moving is like as if he had One For All. And it's so powerful that it like breaks off All For One's right arm. And it goes back to what I was saying, like, they should be able to give this to multiple people. Like, they're wasting their resources with the Troy system and all those other elevator and shielding systems. Like, if you just give, like, 12 people these suits, you would have such an easier time going against the villains here. But he's able to use multiple abilities here, like Charge Bolt and Black Whip. And then obviously this is a callback to what his students in Class 1A are able to do. Charge Bolt, Black Whip, Cellophane. We even get a shout out to Sugar Man in this sequence as well. All of the strategies and the abilities and the moves and combos that he's able to perform here are just all inspiration from his students, which I think is a nice touch and a coming full circle here, because All Might is the main person who inspired the hero generation in this world. So now the heroes that he's inspired have inspired him. And I just think that's a pretty cool touch by Horikoshi. And as All Might is tying up All For One here, he says that the suit and the car are meant to keep him in the fight for a little bit. And then he came up with the specs in a design request, and that what he has right now are from the fruits of the labor that he's made with his friend. And then we see Melissa from the first movie. This whole sequence implies that the armored All Might Hulkbuster mech suit that he has here is because of Rebecca in America. And this is also canonizing Rebecca. And I know for the longest time, we've had those statements from Horikoshi where he's saying that the continuity of the movies and the manga are one and the same, or they're aligned or whatever. But I just think it's cool that he's just fully showing us that, like, yeah, Rebecca from the first movie is a canon character. All of that stuff matters. Now, her dad originally is the one that helped All Might when he came over and trained in America during his like college years. But he's in jail right now because of the events of the first movie. So it's kind of just like Melissa, his daughter, who is like still there. She's also the one that helped manufacturing Izuku's red gauntlets that he has right now. So it just makes sense that she would help in making this armored All Might. But at the end of the chapter, we see All Might hitting All for One with just shoot style smash, and he's just leveling him. Like, it's so powerful. Like, it's crazy how powerful this is. Like, he's hitting him like as if he has one for all 70%, or maybe even more than that. Like, it's incredible how far this technology is going. And at the end of the chapter, he says, not once in my entire life have I gone into battle expecting to lose. Meaning that, like, he's not here to just exclusively buy time. Like, he does expect to beat All for One here. Like, he does believe in himself. And it makes me think, like, is he going to win? Like, is All Might going to survive this ultimately and beat the Death Flags? So, coming off of the previous chapter, we came back to the confrontation between All Might and All for One. All Might is currently trying to stop All for One from reaching UA, because if he makes it there, he'll be able to fuse with Shigaraki, merging the two All for One quirks, but also, you know, gaining Shigaraki's body and becoming all powerful. So powerful that he'll be able to take One for All from Izuku, something that he wasn't able to do before because he just didn't have enough hatred. But once he takes over Shigaraki's body, he in theory should have an adequate amount of hatred to be able to use his own All for One quirk to finally take One for All. So yeah, All Might doesn't want that to happen, and since most of the other heroes are out of commission or have been defeated at this point, All Might's like the only one left. Like, quirkless All Might, only one who can stop All for One at this point, or at least slow him down. And he winds up using like this robotic armor suit that he calls Armored All Might. This is actually made for him by Melissa in America. Melissa is the daughter of David Shield, All Might's friend that he met in America during his time that he spent there training after Nana was killed by All for One. You can actually see all these characters in the first movie. It's so good. It's definitely the best My Hero movie, maybe one of the best battle anime movies ever. It's so good. But this suit is incredibly powerful. Like, that's kind of an understatement, because we saw that All for One had just taken care of most of like the top 15 heroes by himself. And All Might, using this armor, you know, quirkless nerfed All Might, is wrecking All for One. I mean, he's not in a situation to like completely defeat him, of course, but he's doing just as good, if not better, than all of the other heroes individually did. I mean, aside from like Endeavor, but you know, he had freaking Hellfire quirk. But aside from like his durability to take All for One's blasts, like not even Gigantomachia could like take one of these things. He has multiple support items that assist in his style here. And they're all based off of his students and their quirks. And I always liked how that was like coming full circle, because All Might had inspired so many heroes, and now the heroes that he inspired are inspiring him. Sorry if I sound like a broken record, guys. I know I've said that a few times now, but I just really do like All Might. He's my favorite character in the series, and I appreciate that he's having his one final moment here. It's better than nothing, to be honest, but coming into this fight, you're thinking that he's just going to die because of, first of all, the huge imbalance in power, but also Night Eye's prophecy, you know, going all the way back to the Overhaul arc, where he foresaw All Might dying like a horrible death, and we've been waiting the whole series to see if that was going to come true or not. So if there is a point where it's going to come to fruition, it's in this battle. I mean, there's a chance that it's not, but it seems like the perfect place for it to happen. But All Might isn't expecting to lose here. Like, he's going into this battle trying to win. Like, he's not just aimlessly sacrificing himself so that Izuku has more time. And coming into this chapter, as he's beating down All for One, he says, this feels wrong. I'm over 55 years old, you know? I shouldn't be beating up a young lad. So young lad referring to All for One because he's been rewinding, using like a reverse engineered variant of Eri's quirk that Yujiko was able to make for him, but it like perpetually rewinds him, so he will eventually die, like turn to nothingness. So he is on a ticking clock here, and he originally was like, I don't know, like 100 something, and now it's rewound him back to like, I don't know, maybe his college years or maybe his high school years. Maybe he's like a teenager right now. But as for All Might saying that he himself is over 55 years old, that's pretty crazy because we never heard that before, I'm pretty sure. I've always tried to figure out All Might's age. And if you do the math and like collect context clues and everything, you will come around to like 55 or over 55. So yeah, I mean, it is somewhat accurate. I mean, Horikoshi would know, but also just, reminds us that All Might is pretty old. I mean, not that old. He's not like a senior citizen, but in the My Hero world, he doesn't seem like he would be that old, but he's been on top for like over 30 years. Like, that's why the world has warped the way that it has, because of All Might. It wasn't like he just did this in like 10 years. It took him multiple decades to completely change the world, for the better and for the worse. Of course, making it a better place and reducing the crime rate to near zero, but also making the world reliant on him. Because as we've seen, since he was nerfed, everything has been falling apart. But going further, All Might says you've been falling victim to the overwhelming hatred you've cultivated so you could steal One for All. So All Might knows that All for One hates him. Like, All for One rarely shows emotion other than like being cool, calm, and collected and making these corny jokes and, being maniacal and like smirking and stuff. But only All Might really makes him lose his cool. So All Might is finally using that to his advantage, and he's talking crap on All for One. Like, he's trying to distract him with trash talking, make him frustrated and have openings that he otherwise wouldn't have, because that's what All for One was doing to All Might in their previous battles. Like, I'm pretty sure Gran Torino tells All Might during his fight with All for One in season 3 that All Might got hit in his stomach, the thing that nerfed him, by All for One because he let his guard down because of All for One essentially talking crap. Like, he was saying something to All Might, and then that gave him the opening to hit him in the stomach with whatever he hit him with. And we also saw All for One doing it to All Might in that very fight as well. So now All Might's not only learned from his students, but he's also learned from his previous battles, because instead of just running after All for One and beating him down with fists, he's now mentally going after him. And he's like, Demon Lord, funniest joke I ever heard, even a quirkless man can take you head on. Demon Lord, of course, is like the moniker that All for One always refers to himself as, because when he was younger, he was really into comic books, and he liked this one comic that involved a Demon Lord. Then we see a frustrated All for One use spring-like limbs, physical boost, air cannon, rivet stab, dark ball, and light dust. All of these quirks in unison, and creates like this massive blast. Like, it's so big, it's blowing away like multiple city blocks. Like, one of the craziest feats we've seen in the series. And All for One, of course, is just casually capable of this, but All Might apparently is casually capable of surviving this thing. I mean, yeah, it expended one of his valuable utilities here in his Auto Guard Dark Shadow cape, which is, of course, in reference to Tokoyami, but this thing was strong enough to survive that blast from All for One. I mean, it was like a one-time use, but still, this thing would take out essentially any character in the series. And as for all of the quirks he used to create this blast, it still doesn't narrow down exactly what these things are. I mean, we can see the black balls and the air cannon, but like, what is light dust? And what is making this electricity that we always see with All for One? Especially since he's rewound back. He's regained like large amounts of this black lightning. Like, we saw it sometimes when he was going against All Might in season 3, but we predominantly saw it when he was going against Nana in that Two Heroes flashback. It's probably just Horikoshi making a cool aesthetic here. Probably shouldn't read too much into it. It is pretty much part of the course of like top battle manga at the moment to have like some kind of like black lightning associated with your powerful characters. I mean, literally like the big 3 right now all have this in some capacity. Like, One Piece has Conqueror Haki Lightning, Jujutsu Kaisen has like Black Flash, but also just, you could be powerful in Jujutsu Kaisen and your cursed energy can emit like this black lightning. And then of course we have this coming from All for One, and I'm sure Izuku will probably have something like that too. I mean, he already has like the green lightning, but I'm sure it'll be different and thicker as the series goes on. But after All Might takes this blast, we see that a lot of his armor has been damaged, and that he activates maximum motion assist. So I guess this is like his last hurrah. Like, his suit can only really last, I don't know, 1 or 2 more sequences after this. And All for One is like walking him down. He's like, you're a worthless piece of crap. Like, he's really angry here. This is the most emotion we've seen All for One convey in the series. And he's like, tools cannot surpass their limits. And then we see All Might remembering talking to Izuku about this. I think this might have been season 3, where he says you can't rely on your support items too much, especially if losing it makes you feel helpless. Like, he's seen plenty of heroes fall into that trap. So I guess this is going to come into play with All Might here. Like, I think he might lose access to this, and then he does something to capitalize on All for One. I don't know if he'll straight up defeat him, although I think it would be fitting if he does. It's just that we need to see All for One fuse with Shigaraki one way or another. And I do think that will end with Shigaraki becoming the dominant personality, but I just don't have high hopes for All Might sealing the deal here completely. Like, I think Shigaraki will be the one that completely kills All for One. But then we see this flashback of All Might as a high school student with like in the aftermath of Nana taking down like all of these villains, and we see All Might holding like a pipe, and Nana's like, you know, were you planning on taking them down with that pipe? Of course, referencing to all of the support stuff that's been going on here, and All for One saying tools cannot surpass their limits. But I think this also might be the first time that All Might met Nana, something that we didn't see before. And then of course this led All Might on his hero journey and receiving One for All, because at this moment he's quirkless. Well, I mean, in the flashback he's also quirkless presently, but coming back to the battle, we see All Might landing a blow to All for One's head, and All for One's like, I didn't fall for your pathetic plan, you hear me? And he's like, I'm gonna win no matter what. I have extra time to take you out, so, you know, don't worry about it. I'm not mad. But, you know, he obviously is. And All Might's like, you know, stop making excuses. And that's where the chapter ends. And like I said, I'm really curious to see what is going to ultimately happen with this, because I just don't think narratively wise All Might can take the final W here. I mean, I'm sure he'll have some kind of W, but it won't be a super satisfying one, I think. So we have a really great chapter here today, guys. It's been a really great stretch of chapters with this series, with the final run of All Might, I guess you could say, in his final battle against All for One, using his armored All Might suit that makes him unbelievably powerful. But, you know, we've already talked about that enough. But at the end of the previous chapter, we went into a flashback of All Might, I guess, meeting Nana for the first time when he was still a student, and of course still quirkless. And he had like this pipe where he was going to help Nana fight against these villains. And coming into this chapter, we're continuing that flashback as to where he was like following Nana like wherever she was going. I guess she was like walking home or something, and All Might's like, you know, please take me on as your disciple. And Nana told him like, you know, no, you're quirkless. I can't really, you know, do much for you. You know, go ahead and take that pipe and protect your own loved ones. And of course, this is supposed to parallel how Izuku and All Might first met, because it was pretty much the same thing. All Might was at the top of his game. Izuku was the fanboy, begging him to take him on. But All Might telling him that like, hey, you're quirkless. You know, there's not much I could do for you. Maybe you could become a cop, you know, whatever. And the major theme of this chapter, I guess, is just parallels and coming full circle, which I really enjoy from Horikoshi because he does it really well with his characters. But going more into the flashback here between All Might and Nana, All Might says that I don't have any family, and they were killed a long time ago, and that's super interesting. Of course, that's in response to Nana telling him to protect his own loved ones. And to be honest, we didn't really know too much about All Might's backstory at all, and I was fine with that. I didn't really think All Might needed like a detailed backstory or whatever. He was All Might. He was the symbol of peace. He was just a genetic specimen. He was born to be who he is. And that's all I really needed personally. And I didn't really think too much about it, but I'm glad that we're getting into it, because now that I'm thinking about it, it is kind of needed. And it also kind of signifies that he is for sure going to die, unfortunately. I mean, we all for sure know that it's coming at this point, but you know, maybe sometimes we kind of lull ourselves into a false sense of security and maybe think, oh no, he's gonna make it out of this. But you know, now that we're getting the flashback, and also considering what we're going to be talking about later on with his freaking pseudo vestige or half vestige, whatever you want to call it, acknowledging him, yeah, it's not looking good for our boy here. But going more into the flashback, Nana also says that her family was killed. And this is interesting because it's like, I don't know if All for One killed All Might's family. I don't think he did. If he did, it would have been acknowledged by now. I think All Might's family was just killed by crime or whatever, a villain or somebody with a renegade quirk, whatever. And I guess you could say that All for One maybe is responsible for that, because this flashback, it doesn't say how long ago it was. I think it was like 40 years ago, I don't know, 30 something years ago or something. At that point, we were about 60, 50, I don't know, something around there into quirk society, because I think the dawn of quirks happened like 100 something years ago, you know, a little over 100 years ago maybe. And a lot of what came out of that was the result of All for One, because in my opinion, at the dawn of quirks at that time, All for One was like one of the first people to ever receive a quirk. Now that's not confirmed, I'm just assuming that he was. Him and his brother Yoichi, the first user of One for All. So it's understandable that the direct results of his actions had like a trickle down effect that bled into society for the next, 40, 50 years or whatever. Kind of like how World War II has had an effect on our current society. Think about it that way, I guess. So maybe it did inadvertently lead to the death of All Might and even Nana's parents. But this is just showing us that All Might doesn't want revenge for that. He just wants to protect everyone. Because he's like, criminals in this world get rewarded for their actions. And you can rebuild the houses that were destroyed, and things will go back to the way that they were on the surface. But the tenants, the people who live there, they will live in fear forever. And that's very true. And then ultimately he wants to make a place where everyone can live with a smile. And for that, the world needs a symbol of peace. And this is just showing that like All Might was always that guy. He always wanted to be this person. He genuinely has this unrequited altruism to him. He was born to be this hero, the same way that Izuku was. And the flashback ends with All Might saying, "I'm quirkless, born without a role." And like I was saying in the beginning, this comes full circle here. Because All Might, born quirkless, eventually meets Nana, gets one for all from her, becomes All Might, becomes the symbol of peace, but now he is ending his life, once again quirkless as he was born, but still fulfilling his duty as the symbol of peace, ultimately defeating All for One despite that. And like I said, I really enjoy this storytelling from Horikoshi. This is what I've always wanted from the series. And I know that I've been very vocal about me wanting All Might to have the same thing that's going on with All for One, as to where, some kind of plot intervention would allow All Might to rewind the same way that he is. And that we could see All Might using One for All for one last time. But now that I'm reading this chapter, I understand where Horikoshi is going with All Might having the armored All Might, and having, of course, inspiration from the students with his support gear and everything. It's to have All Might finish his duty as he started, and that's being quirkless. And I respect it. But anyway, going back to the fight itself, we see All Might using another support item. This is, of course, based off of Ashido, where he calls it the super acid injection, and he freaking stabs All for One in the stomach and injects him with acid. This is freaking crazy. It's a pretty ruthless move from All Might, to be honest, but he would only ever do this to All for One. Like, I doubt he would do this to another villain. It's just way too ruthless for him. Like, it's corroding him from the inside out. And of course, if this wasn't All for One, it would essentially be like an instant kill. But considering that All for One is able to survive this, it's really taking its toll on him, because he has to heal himself, use multiple quirks, in fact, to be able to do that. But at the same time, he's burning himself away even more than he was already, because it's making him rewind even more than he already was. So now he's becoming even younger than what he already was. And I don't know how young he is in this chapter. I didn't know how young he was before. There's no like narration telling us his age, but I don't know if he was like a college age student coming into this fight. Maybe now he's a middle schooler possibly, or maybe, I don't know, young high school, 9th grade territory. But we see All for One eventually hit All Might onto this roof, and coincidentally, this is the same roof where All Might met Izuku. And of course, goes back to what we were talking about with the parallels, coming full circle, where he told Izuku the truth about, him being nerfed and damaged, but also about Izuku not being able to be a hero because he was quirkless. And then we also see this flashback of Izuku moving without his body, telling him when he was saving Bakugo from the sludge villain, but also back when Stain encountered All Might. He said, the man we knew as All Might could not live his life any other way. Going back to All Might was born to be the symbol of peace. And also us seeing Stain here. Stain is still out there. He is going to come back in these last couple chapters for sure. And I just really hope that he has a moment with Dabi and Toga before they die, because they are both currently on their deathbeds, or it's at least implied that they are. And if we don't get that Dabi moment with them, I think it would be kind of tragic. But All Might's really messed up from fighting All for One here. I mean, he's always kind of been on the edge here I mean, just at his base, he is, severely damaged and nerfed and quirkless. So using this armor isn't like fully protecting him. He is still taking damage, as it says, like his respiratory system is malfunctioning and his whole body is damaged. But that's not stopping him, of course. All Might is that dude, and he gets up and he starts laughing at All For One. And he calls for another support item. And he's like, how good it feels to help everyone. Like, this is a really amazing sequence. This is like All Might's final stand here. He's doing everything that he's ever wanted to do, and he's dying doing what he loves. And in this panel, we see All Might's right eye become normal. And that's fascinating because this whole entire series, we've seen All Might with the darkened eyes. The darkened eyes, of course, are a result of him taking that damage from All For One 7 years ago. Or 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago at this point. The damage to his stomach that we see in the first episode that nerfed him. Before that, of course, he had normal eyes. Go back to the first movie, The Two Heroes. When you see him in America, back in his college age years, I guess, he was normal. He had the regular sclera, the white, and now he has black sclera, which is a cool aesthetic, but just signifies that he has been damaged. But somehow, in his final moments of clarity here, his eyes are turning back. It's a nice little touch from Horikoshi here. And we see the final support items that he called upon. It's like these Doc Ock arms, and it's like he has like a gun and like a shield thing combo. He's really going all out. Like, he looks like he's a robot from the UA exams, like when the students have to go against those robots. He looks like something like that, considering that this tech is coming from like America, from Malicious Shield. But he calls it Gravity Thruster Ingenium, going back to the recurring thing of his students inspiring him. And in this case, we have Uraraka and Ida. And before he gets to do whatever he's going to do against All For One, we see the freaking vestige of All Might, or the energy ghost, or whatever you want to call this, the vestige ghost of All Might. We see it for one panel, and it's implied that it's acknowledging All Might, which is interesting because we never really knew what was going on with this thing. Like, all of the other vestiges of One For All make sense because they're just kind of like force ghosts. Like, they're dead and they live within the quirk factor of One For All. But with All Might, there's kind of just like a fiery apparition version of him, which I guess means that he has one foot in the grave. Or another way that you can look at it is that there was enough of his information copied onto the quirk factor when he passed it on to Izuku, as to where there's like this placeholder there for him. And then when he fully dies, then he will become, the full-blown vestige of One For All, which I think we will see. And that will be like the big reunion between All Might and Nana, because the vestiges like live in One For All and like can like talk to each other and stuff. Like, I don't know like what's going on with that. I don't know if they're just always there and they're kind of just existing in that room at all times, or they just kind of come and go. It's not fully explained. But I do think we're going to see this moment where All Might is like the full-blown ghost vestige, and he meets Nana, and then I guess that will be his final moments with Izuku. But another time that we saw the All Might Force Ghost was when Bakugo was on his deathbed. So maybe this is like a way that All Might, I don't know, like brings Bakugo back to life after Edge Shot became his heart or something. I wouldn't be surprised if we see something like that. That's like All Might's final thing that he does in the series. Like, after he does whatever he's going to do with All For One, he like brings Bakugo back or something. But we're coming to the end of the chapter here, where Izuku is facing off against Shigaraki at UA. And I guess this is him saying All Might. Like, he's acknowledging like what's going on with All Might mid-fight against Shigaraki. And by the way, we haven't been privy as to what's been going on with Izuku and Shigaraki. They've kind of just been frozen in time while everything else has been going on. But I guess in this moment, Izuku is acknowledging that All Might is going for his final run here. And in the final panel, we see All Might acknowledging Izuku as well. He's like, young Midoriya. But in Japanese, I think he's saying like Midoriya Shonen. And it says All Might's determination reaches Deku. So yeah, this is like their final time together, I guess. All Might and Izuku for one last time. And I'm on board with it. Like, I cannot wait to see how this turns out. It's really exciting, guys.
So coming into this chapter, the battle between All Might and All For One is continuing, with All Might using his armored All Might suit, that has multiple abilities and functions, all based off of his Class 1A students. And as he's trying to avoid All For One's attacks, going through buildings and whatnot, All Might thinks to himself, and he says that if his body rewinds faster, the more damage he takes, then I should use that quirk. And obviously we're going to find out at the end of the chapter what he's talking about here, but I originally thought that he was talking about another student's quirk, either Izuku's or Bakugo's. And I know that he's already kind of used Izuku before with Black Whip and Shoot Style, but it still makes me think that he kind of has to use One For All in some way, right? I think that would be kind of fitting, unless he just avoids that, but he's definitely going to use Bakugo's as well. And he might save that for last if it's not Izuku's pseudo One For All or whatever he's going to do. But Bakugo's quirk is kind of worrying because, you know, it's explosion. And he's already kind of used this gauntlet fire blast thing called Shoto. He uses it in this chapter actually, but also considering what's going on with Bakugo right now as to where he's like half dead, half alive. And we also saw All Might's vestige ghost thing react to him in the previous chapter, and we saw that react with Bakugo, so maybe that's how this sequence ends. The final quirk he uses is Bakugo's explosion quirk, and yeah, I don't want to say that this is going to end like Vegeta with the final explosion, but man, it all could connect here. But also going into what he was saying about All For One, we found out that yeah, the more damage he takes, the faster he rewinds, and the more effort he uses, you know, using quirks and putting more strain on himself by using more powers and abilities, that also rewinds him faster. And he's been rewinding, of course, because of the quirk Serum Vial. I don't really think you see what he does, but Yujiko was able to reverse engineer Eri's quirk and gave All For One like a one-time use thing that rewound his body because it was so heavily damaged from his fight with All Might 7 years ago. But there's like no regulator to it, so he's rewinding into nothingness. And right now he's like a teenager, I guess. It's not really made clear, but he's coming dangerously close to, you know, rewinding to nothingness, considering he started at like over 100 years old. But All Might says that the problem is the energy source. And then he summons these two bird robots called Anima, of course in reference to Kota. And as All Might's running away, trying to avoid All For One just catches up with him between these two buildings. And he says, it's like, I know that you're trying to pretty much exhaust me and make me use more power and effort so that I'll rewind faster. And he's like, no, I'll just kill you with minimal effort. And we see him activate his blade quirk. I think Lucasu said it was called Tendrils quirk or something. I don't know if this is ever identified. Maybe it is in the Ultra Analysis 2 book, but I think someone else has called it like Cyberpunk Blades or something. And he hits All Might with these things. And as All Might's able to escape it with like a jet propulsion thing or whatever, All For One is able to counter him with like these giant mouths. It looks like 90s graffiti art almost. And I'm not sure what he's doing here. It looks like he's making them out of the cyberpunk tendril things, but how would he be able to do that unless he's just like going all out full artist mode and just crafting them through the tendrils? And it's like, it seems like a lot of effort, but apparently it's not, because he says that they're nothing. You know, in reference to what he just said previously about how he'll kill him with minimal effort. Apparently these giant mouth things are minimal effort to him. And as he tries to like eat All Might with these things, you know, obviously it doesn't work out. And All Might's still evading them by going through multiple buildings and whatnot. All For One is like roasting All Might for using the support items in the suit that he's using, especially based off of his students' abilities. And he's kind of chasing down All Might like a horror movie villain at this point. And he says, your light is far gone. And he just smashes All Might like in the stomach again. Of course, I'm sure this is in reference to where he damaged him 7 years ago. And it cuts to All Might, I guess, like in his mind, like in that black blizzardy space where he was covering the ember of One For All before in their previous fight in season 3. But now there's no light there. And of course, this is a reference to what All For All was saying, your light is far gone. And light means multiple things here, but the main meaning is the One For All quirk, of course, because when he passed it off to Izuku, he only had quote unquote embers of it left. That's how they were both able to be powerful at the same time. There were some lingering bits of One For All and All Might's quirk factor, I guess, and after he used the United States of Smash and All For One, it was just completely gone. But then All Might somehow counters All For One and sticks the Shoto flamethrower cannon piece in All For One's mouth. And All Might says, oh, you don't get it. People are flickering beings. Even if my light goes out, someone else will take it and keep shining. Of course, in reference to his students, not just Izuku taking up the mantle of One for All, but all of the students in Class 1A, which is All Might righting his wrongs as well, because he became too good at what he does. He always wanted to be the symbol of peace so people didn't have to worry, and he did. But he became so powerful and so good that they became reliant on him. Like there was no one else that could have picked up after he was gone. But now that he's fostered Class 1A, it also got lucky that they were so unbelievably powerful and so far ahead of everyone else, even the top 10 heroes. Now they are able to continuing the shining that All Might set forth. And we're finally coming back to Aoyama going against Kunita. This fight was set up, I don't even remember, so long ago. Kunita, the Tartarus escapee. And it appears that Kunita has some kind of like plant quirk. I don't think it's being fully explained in this chapter or even given a name, but Kunita says that his seeds can only grow from human flesh. So I guess he needs to like implant some kind of special seed that he can produce in you, and then it makes like this litany of plants, and after that it's pretty standard like plant user stuff in battle manga. But we're also finding out that this is happening 300 meters from UA, I guess, or where the original battle started. And all 32 heroes that were supposed to be taking care of the remaining villains have been defeated, I guess, except for Aoyama, including even Fat Gum here. Fat Gum is being drained by these plants, so much so that he can't even use his quirk, the fat absorption, and he's gone back to thin mode. I don't know if this is like Fat Gum's final moment in the series, him giving the rub to Aoyama, I guess, and that's fine. Fat Gum did have his moment in season 4. But Kunita takes Aoyama's laser belt thing, and we're seeing like what happens when Aoyama doesn't have his belt on. Like his laser quirk seeps out of his belly button. And I've always thought that this was like supposed to be like Cyclops from the X-Men. I think that's what Horikoshi was kind of inspired by here. Like if Cyclops doesn't have his visor on, his laser eye quirk just goes out of control. Obviously it's not as extreme as that, but similar. And we also found out that this wasn't always Aoyama's quirk. Like he was born quirkless, and they were essentially coerced by All For One into giving little Aoyama this naval laser quirk from All For One. But since his body wasn't compatible with it, it's all messed up the way that it is, and it's just been a burden to Aoyama. And that also caused them to be subservient to All For One since they were indebted to him, which also caused them to be informants to him and also traitors, which Kunita calls Aoyama, which is like hilarious because it's not only because he's a traitor to the heroes, but he's also like a traitor to the villains as well because he ultimately told them everything. But that fires up Aoyama, and he's like, hey, calling me a traitor reminded me of my sins and made me even more determined to cling to their lights. Got more light talk in this chapter, of course. And he's like, I want to shine even brighter than before. And he starts just firing off lasers, but since he doesn't have the belt to like concentrate it, he can't direct it where he wants it to go. So he's just blasting like these ultra powerful laser salvos, but they're just unable to hit Kunita. Then out of nowhere, Hagakure shows up and she redirects the light at Kunita, and they just do like this sandwich blast to him. So Hagakure is able to do this because her quirk that makes her invisible is able to bend and reflect light. Like that's the principle that makes her invisible in the first place. Just like Sue Storm from the Fantastic Four. So she's able to reflect Aoyama's light back at Kunita here. And also in the sequence, we're seeing her face. And I know that we've seen her face fully for at least a year and a half now. I think she appeared on the cover of a chapter or something. But I think like within the actual manga itself, this is the clearest we've ever seen her face, and it's fitting since, this is the end. But yeah, this is what she looks like in case you weren't aware. And I guess this is defeating Kunita. I was unsure of it in the spoilers, but looking at it now, I guess this is him being defeated. Like it's just being wrapped up in this chapter, which is fine. It didn't really need much longer than this, I guess. But we come back to All Might at the end of the chapter, and he once again says that he doesn't plan on losing to All For One, which makes me think that he might legitimately defeat him here. But he's been in the sky with the assistance from those birds, the anima robots that he called for, and he finally has charged up his attack enough, and he hits All For One with his can't stop twinkling ultimate super laser thing. It just fires down from the sky into the city and just roasts up All For One here. I mean, I don't think he's being defeated by this, of course, but this might lead us to the end of the battle here because this is massive. And it goes back to All Might's plan in the beginning, of course, where he said, you know, if his body rewinds faster, the more damage he takes, then I should use that quirk. That quirk, now we're finding out, is his Aoyama inspiration quirk, where he's just firing a massive laser at All For One. He even has like a power cord running like a block away into him. And I assume that this is really going to damage him for sure. And we might see like child All For One in the next chapter, like 5-year-old All For One. That would be crazy. But let me know what you thought about this chapter in the comments, guys. And if you liked it, please give it a like and please subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great day and I'll see you in the next one.
So this chapter continues the battle between All Might and All For One. But before we continue that, we're seeing Aoyama with Hagakure coming off of their fight against Kunita where they ostensibly defeated him. Aoyama was able to use some powerful naval lasers and reflect them off of Hagakure using her quirk, hitting Kunita. And the aftermath is that Hagakure's quirk is like glitching and she is now visible. So this is like her big moment. You know, considering that we're coming to the end of the series here, this needed to happen. Like, you know, starting from the beginning, you know, coming in, you see an invisible girl character. We all more or less think the same thing. It's like, okay, so when's the moment going to be where she finally fully becomes visible? And we've had teases before this, you know, little reflections or little glances. But no, this is like it. This is like her in her birthday suit for some reason. This is her, you know, presented the way that she is. I won't comment about it. We all know what's going on here. Horikoshi is going to Horikoshi, and I'll leave it at that. But this is the moment, like I said, so yeah. But we see them continuing to take out the plants that were planted by Kunita because it said that they can still grow even if the user is unconscious. And, you know, considering that they're still going through heroes and whatnot, they need to get them out of them. And since we're seeing them do this busy work, I guess that means that Kunita might come back, because it was oddly easy to take him out. Or they're going to have to fight somebody else. But yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to them at least one more time. But we're coming back to All Might firing off the laser that he was shooting at All For One at the end of the previous chapter. The one that was inspired by Aoyama, but it's actually inspired by another person. And that's Star and Stripe. Because All Might says, you know, Star's final battle inspired me, but I can't solidify the lasers like she did. And of course, he's talking about Star and Stripe's fight against Shigaraki, although All For One was present as well. They were kind of doing that half-consciousness thing, but in my opinion, that might be the best fight in the series. Next to All Might versus All For One in Season 3, but what she was able to do with the lasers, like what All Might's talking about here, is that her team had like these jets, and the jets were able to fire off these lasers, and using her quirk, which is absolutely busted, she was able to like make them tangible and grab them and use them as like weapons. Really cool stuff. We're probably going to see that at the beginning of Season 7, right? I think. So look out for that. Also makes me sad that we're not going to get to see Star and Stripe and All Might interact. That would have been cool, but whatever. I think we're all agreeing that she was somewhat of a wasted character, but, you know, it is what it is. But anyway, All For One is trying to escape from getting, you know, shot with this laser, but All Might keeps him in there using Soundwave's earphone jack, so that's like Jiro's influence on All Might's support items here. And yes, we're going to see like over 20 support items here, you know, one for each student and whatever else inspiration he has here. As he's continuing to fight against All For One, we're cutting away to this, I guess to this grandmother and her grandson who are watching TV, and they're watching the fight between All Might and All For One, and the grandson's asking like, you know, what's going to happen? Like, who are they? And the grandmother says that she doesn't know. She doesn't really keep up with the hero stuff, but it doesn't matter who wins because, you know, they're fighting in a faraway country, and that's not necessarily the case here. Like, if All Might wins, yeah, nothing really affects them, but if All For One wins, he's essentially going to take over the world and more or less make them become reliant on him for like natural resources and whatnot. I don't know if that's like entirely what he wants to do, but it was heavily implied that that's what he wants, like to be the Dark Lord or whatever he says. But we're coming back to All Might, and the laser that he was firing off finally runs out and like the gun breaks. And of course it doesn't kill All For One, and he's coming out of the crater here after getting blasted on, and he's regressed heavily in age. He's like, I don't know, 10, maybe even 8, maybe even younger than that. And this is because the more that he has to use his regeneration quirks and other quirks that are going to heal him, and the more damage that he takes, it further rewinds him. And we were talking about this in the previous chapter. Now it's come to fruition, but not only has he become younger, but he's shining. Like, it's even noted by All Might. It's like his body is shining. And I don't know what to make of this. It's pretty fascinating, right? Because I think the only other instance we've seen of shining, aside from like, Twinkling or Hagakure or whatever, is from the Shining Baby. The very first quirk user. In the first chapter, it said that, the birth of quirk started with a Shining Baby in China. So does that mean that All for One was the Shining Baby this whole time? That would be amazing, actually. I mean, I guess it's possible because we don't have exact timelines, full names, or anything like that, or birthdays, dates. And it's also heavily implied that All for One was around at the dawn of quirks. Like, I'm pretty sure he was one of the first people to have a quirk, right? So that would be really interesting if he was the Shining Baby. Now, why does he shine? I don't know. Why does he not shine as an adult? Why does he shine as he gets younger? Not really sure. Now, this doesn't mean that he is the baby, of course. It could just be Horikoshi calling back to the beginning, because this could be the end of quirks. It begins with the Shining Baby, and it winds up ending with a Shining Child. Like, this is the true quirk singularity, where quirks eventually just collapse on themselves. And it, starts and ends with whatever All for One is doing here. And, I guess Izuku remedies it. He saves everyone, of course, but this could be the catalyst for the end. Just taking a guess. I mean, there is obviously some serious symbology here with the glowing child. And I'm on board with any of the options here. But All for One starts to mutate this growth out of his back. Similar to what Shigaraki was doing earlier on in this arc back at UA. Because it turns out that his body had been modified so that it could keep up with the amount of power that it was receiving from All for One and all the quirks in it. So his quirk singularity adjusted body. And it just started making all these growths and whatnot and deformities and just massive flesh abominations. And this might be happening with All for One too. Maybe the younger he gets, the more his body becomes accustomed to the quirk singularity or the power that he's receiving from All for One. I don't know, just taking a guess because we haven't really seen him do something like this yet, right? Or maybe it's just another quirk. But before we get to see what it is, he freezes. And that's because Stain's here. He was able to lick some of All for One's blood that was on a rock or on a building or something. I guess some splattered on there during his battle with All Might. But this is incredible because Stain's quirk is strong enough to work on All for One. His quirk involves him taking in somebody's blood, and once he does, they freeze essentially. They become immobile. And it works even on All for One. And I'm so glad that he's back because I think Stain is one of the best characters in the series, and he was heavily underutilized. I think he could have been used way more than what he actually was. And also, I'm glad that he's having another moment with All Might because his last moment with All Might was kind of anticlimactic and disappointing in my opinion. But maybe it was supposed to be because now we're getting this. And I really hope that they get to fight together. I mean, I don't know if they will because at the end, Stain's take him down, All Might. So, maybe this was just his setup, his alley-oop here. But it would be really cool if they got to at least do one attack together or something like that. But if not, this is good enough, I suppose. But really cool sequence. Stain and All Might working together to take down All for One. It sounds like fan fiction if you would have said this a couple years ago. But really satisfying to see this. I hope we get at least one more sequence. And does this mean that this is the end of the next chapter? Is All Might going to be taking down All for One? Are we going to get the answer to why he's shining? What's going on with that? And Stain's here now, and I don't think he's going to leave. He's just going to be going to UA at this point. I think everyone will eventually converge there. And like I also said before in my previous videos, Stain needs to have his moment with Toga and Dabi. He hasn't met them yet. And if you're thinking, wait, he hasn't? And it's I know, right? That should have happened, but it hasn't. It's Toga and Dabi, their whole motivation for joining the League of Villains was Stain. I mean, obviously, their full backstories have been fleshed out, and there's way more to them than just being Stain stands. But when they came into the series, that's all that they were, and then they got fully fleshed out, and Stain wasn't really a part of their thing anymore. But still, they need to meet. and Stain needs to say some words of wisdom to them. And I know that Toga and Dabi are on their deathbeds right now, but they're not fully confirmed to be dead, so hopefully he can talk to them and then they die. I'll take that at least. So coming off of the previous chapter, we saw Stain come out of nowhere and paralyze All For One by licking his blood off some debris, helping All Might in his fight. And coming into this chapter, we're seeing how he was able to do it. So first of all, he was tracking the path of destruction that their fight left after overhearing what Ida and Shoto were talking about. Also, Stain calling Ita Ingenium in this chapter, like his hero name, which goes to show that Stain fully recognizes Ida as a hero, which we knew from a couple chapters back, but this is kind of like the final touch there, which is, you know, coming full circle from when Stain didn't acknowledge Ida as a hero in that first Stain arc. And I'm sure he would have called Shoto if he knew his name. But we're seeing also how he was able to figure out that it was All For One's blood because he smells the blood on the rocks, and he remembers back when he met All Might, and he's like, oh, well, it's not that guy, so I guess it's All For One. And it's like, I understand why Horikoshi is doing this, you know, to explain how Stain was able to do this, but I don't think it was necessary. It kind of makes this sequence even more ridiculous now that we see how he's doing it. But following this, we get something I've always wanted in the series, and that's, first of all, Stain and All Might meeting, which we got before, although it was kind of not exactly the way that I personally wanted it to go down. But I think it's being made up for here because second, they're fighting together. That's another thing that I wanted, which was kind of fanfiction-y, and I wasn't sure it was going to happen, but them fighting side by side and against the ultimate opponent in All For One. It's just a great, satisfying sequence, and I'm so glad that Horikoshi took his time to actually put it in there before it was over completely, because I really do think it was much needed to have this closure here. However, I do think he dropped the ball ultimately with Stain, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but Stain winds up giving his speech to All Might that he originally gave him when they first met, and it ends with All Might saying, like, I get it now, Stain, like Stain actually getting through to All Might. And Stain saying, you should live, that's why I am here, which is like Stain doing his own little rendition of All Might's catchphrase, which is amazing because, you know, Stain is ultimately just the biggest All Might stan. But as they're both charging at All For One to like hit him with a combo attack, All For One does something a little too fantastical, even for him. So first of all, he does forced activation, which we've seen him do before. Like, he's always had this quirk. I think as far back as like season 3, he used it on Magna to like forcefully activate her magnetism quirk to attract the other league members to her so they could escape. However, this time he's using it on himself to forcefully activate his phlebotomy quirk, which we didn't know that he had. Phlebotomy meaning to draw blood, and that's exactly what it's doing. It's pulling all of the blood out of his body, you know, as a way to counter against Stain's quirk, Blood Curdle, that paralyzes you after he's ingested your blood. And it's like, why does All For One have this quirk? It also doesn't really matter. It's like, we'll never get like a full catalog of all the quirks that he has, unless Horikoshi decides to be a mad lad one day and, like, I don't know, in a year or two releases like a full comprehensive data book, and in it, on All For One's page, there's a list of all of his quirks. Probably not gonna happen, but the long and the short of it is that All For One just has any quirk that he needs to get him out of the super specific situation that he is put into a lot into the series. So in this instance, he has a phlebotomy quirk. And also, like, he already knew that he was going to possibly run into this problem because back at Tartarus, when they were escaping, I think it was like around the chapter 200 era, I think it was like 198 or something, he noticed that Stain was the only prisoner that left without his assistance. So he was like, oh, I guess he's gonna come back and fight me one day, so let me figure out a strategy to defend against his quirk. And it's forced activation phlebotomy to pull the blood out of his body, but also using another quirk in antigen modification. So this rewrites his blood's composition. So now he's getting a clean slate here, and I guess this just deactivates Stain's quirk. And of course, All For One needs to put out his justification for having an antigen modification quirk. You know, this is also Horikoshi's talking, but he's saying, like, leaving no evidence is key to reigning in the shadows, you know? So his justification is, like, after, I don't know if this is necessarily after he lost to All Might 6 years ago, or maybe it was throughout his reign of terror, because, you know, he did also rule in the shadows, as he says. So I guess he changed his blood's composition in case any of his DNA DNA got loose so they couldn't track him or whatever. I'll buy it, whatever. If he needs a 3-quirk combo to be able to defeat Stain, that's fine, whatever. But he winds up like shooting one of his quirk singularity appendages at Stain and like biting his midsection, then throwing him like across the city. Like, this is a crazy sequence. Then he just Dragon Ball Z blasts off following after him. And they wind up like at the top of this building. And All For One says that he's going to steal Stain's quirk and that Stain was crucial to Tomura and the League's growth, but that's where his role ended. And it reminded me that, like, yeah, that is the case for sure. Stain had a really big role in season 2. And Toga and Dabi's initial motivations for joining the League were Stain. But then once they, fully fleshed out their characters, that side of them dropped. But Stain's legacy and effect on the series still lived on for sure. And that's where Stain's saying, like, you're wrong. It's all part of a bigger process, Mr. Demon Lord. I never graduated from high school, and you were the one that taught me the meaning of being a hero, referencing All Might. And he's like, win this and keep living. All Might, and before he's able to say everything, All For One, like, punches him or something. But it's like a life-ending smash, like Hulk smash style for sure. I'm pretty sure this is blood that's coming out and everything. And I think he's killing Stain here. Like, this is, it looks like the death of Stain. And I'll say that I thought Stain was going to die. I would have liked it if he lived, of course, but it is what it is. I like that he went down in this sequence. I'm glad that we got it, like I said. However, I think that Stain was ultimately mostly wasted in the series. I think that he should have broken out of Tartarus way sooner, and he should have had more of a recurring role in the series. And now that he's dead, he's not going to have his meeting with Toga or Dabi, which is just a big wasted opportunity in my opinion. I'm just grateful we at least got this chapter, which is very good. I would say it's like a 9 for sure. But after All For One seemingly kills Stain, who, let me also just put out there, might be alive, but I'm just assuming he's dead. It seems like he is. He tries to fire off a blast at All Might to like completely take him out until the last of his Hercules comes and shields him. And All For One blasts it away along with All Might. But that was just enough to keep All Might alive. And all of his armor's blasted off and he's just in his suit now on the ground, severely damaged, but not dead or anything. And he's kind of in this concussed state, I suppose, where he's seeing Nana saying like, hey, it's not over yet. And then he's seeing Night Eye stand over him. And it's essentially just All Might trying to encourage himself. And he's like, I'm not dead yet. And he starts crawling towards All For One. And he's like, so come. And of course, this is coming full circle on what Stain told him. However, say a god has fallen prostrate upon the earth, they should be allowed to crawl for their life. And as he's crawling towards All For One for the final moments of their battle, we see Yue collapsing behind them. And the narration says that All For One is approaching Shigaraki and he's in range to use his gloop warp. Meaning that, yeah, All For One can now finally get to Shigaraki's main body and fuse with him, taking him over completely and becoming like the full-powered All For One. And also being strong enough now to take One For All from Izuku. However, I don't think it's going to go that smoothly. Either All Might is going to stop All For One once and for all, or Shigaraki is. Either way, All For One is going to die in these next couple chapters, I'm pretty sure. And I'm wondering what other fights we're going to move to after this, aside from the inevitable Shigaraki versus Izuku. We also have Bakugo. He's still out there and needs to come back to life fully. So there are some things that need to happen, but mostly everything is wrapped up at this point, I suppose. So coming into this chapter, we're getting confirmation that Shoto and Uraraka have defeated Dabi and Toga. Shoto we know for sure did. Uraraka, on the other hand, her fight ended a little differently, but we're not getting confirmation on if they're alive or dead. I mean, if they're alive, they're definitely in custody. And the way that they left off, it really could be either or. But soon we will get confirmation. There's definitely a reason Horikoshi hasn't been talking about it. But now that Toga has been defeated / died, or / incapacitated or whatever, her twice clones from the Sad Girls Parade are now dissipating, and because of that, the falling UA can float again because they don't have to keep up their weight any longer, because it's become lighter without all the twices there. But now we're coming back to Izuku going against Shigaraki. Like, we're back. We're finally returning to Izuku, and I guess this is like the beginning of the end. Like, this sequence is going to ride us into the end of the series, I suppose, right? Because everything else has already been established and finished at this point. The only thing left is really for Bakugo to come back, which I'm going to talk about later, but that will coincide with this. So it's looking like Horikoshi's estimate that he made last year might be kind of accurate, because it seems like we might have a December or January finish at this point. Just taking a guess. Could be longer than that. But we're seeing Izuku hold off Shigaraki, which he's been doing for a long time now. Like the last, 15 chapters or something maybe. Because, if Shigaraki just touches anything, it'll explode. And we're also seeing how powerful Izuku is right now and just how cool he looks. Like, he looks awesome in this panel, but he's been holding Shigaraki with his black chains, which is like the upgraded black whip. And I just wish we got to see more of Izuku. Like, we did get those chapters earlier where Izuku was fighting against All For One in Shigaraki's body, and that was incredible. Some of the best stuff in the series, easily. Like Izuku using all 7 of his quirks in unison, synergistically. Incredible stuff, but I just wish we got more of it. So hopefully this final battle will deliver, and we'll get to see Izuku go all out. Like, no holding back, everything that he is fully capable of, all the Deus Ex stuff, just everything. Horikoshi should just go all out since it is ending. Why not? But we're coming to them because now All For One is within range to use his Gloop Warp on Shigaraki, because he's been fighting All Might and he's pretty much successfully defeated him. Like, he's destroyed 95% of his support gear, and he's vulnerable to nearly any attack killing him at this point. And All For One says now's the time to fulfill his goal, which is getting to Shigaraki, merging their quirk factors, and taking over his body, because his body is reinforced to be able to hold the full power of All For One, and he has enough hatred to be able to take One For All from Izuku. However, that's definitely not going to happen. It's probably going to be the reverse, and I'll talk about that at the end. But Shigaraki straight up just denies All For One trying to warp him by just shutting his mouth, which is hilarious. And it turns out that Shigaraki's mind is just too strong now, and it's like even overcoming All For One's. And it could go into All For One becoming younger, from Rewind maybe. Then All For One's like, all right, well, I guess I gotta go there in person and just, do it manually. And he grabs All Might and starts flying over there. He's grabbing All Might for Izuku, of course, but also I guess to just kill him in front of everyone, because he says, I'll show them how pathetic you look right now, etc. But also it looks like he's still glowing. And we talked about this before, like when All For One regressed in age again, after he was healing against All Might, he started glowing, and I was questioning, like, so why is he glowing? Because obviously the biggest example of this is the glowing baby from the first chapter, the first person to ever have a quirk. And I thought, like, wait, does this mean that he's the glowing baby, or, what's going on with that? Because the glowing baby was born in China, and I'm pretty sure All For One is Japanese, right? And then I was talking to somebody, and they said, what if All For One just took the glowing baby's quirk? Or maybe it was a glowing man by the time All For One took it, but he just took that quirk because, it was like the first quirk, so why not? And I guess it's kind of like a trophy or whatever. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. That's cool. And if that is the case, and Horikoshi just never explains it, and it's kind of just like an Easter egg for the hardcores, I think that would be fascinating and really cool. Also, another little funny thing in this sequence is Shigaraki is egging on Izuku as All For One is grabbing All Might and flying him there. Like, clearly Shigaraki is against All For One, but he hates All Might even more, and anything to rattle Izuku even more, who is like crying energy tears at this point. And speaking of that, he's remembering, some great memories with All Might. All Might saying, I'll use this very hand to shape my own fate. Izuku saying, I'll be there changing fate by your side. As well as All Might saying, like, you gotta stop being a crybaby. And Izuku trying to fight back the tears. Then suddenly, the vestige ghost of All Might inside of Izuku, inside of the quirk factor of One For All, just disappears. And Izuku's like screaming out, All Might, like he died or something, because that's what that insinuates, right? And it seems like Izuku is reacting to this in the future, or what we're seeing is happening in the future, because we're coming to All Might wrapping himself around All For One, as he was being carried. So I guess what we're seeing here with All Might is happening in the present, and Izuku was reacting in the future, because All Might starts to glow, like there's about to be an explosion or something, and then All For One remembers Nana's final moments. And we're seeing the exact same moment from the All Might Rising manga / OVA back when All For One was in his prime. And I always wondered what his quirks were at this point. Like, what's he using to make the environment look all Tetsuo-esque like this? And I guess it's just some kind of like organic manipulation quirk or something. I don't know. I mean, it looks like the quirk singularity flesh stuff that Shigaraki has, the way that Yujiko modified his body so that he was capable of using All For One's full power. But in this instance, All For One is like manipulating the environment with it instead of his own body. So I don't know what this is, but it's still cool nonetheless. But he's wondering, like, why am I remembering Nana's final moments? Because she died a pathetic death. And then he remembered, what she said as she died. And she said, All Might will be the one to defeat you because Toshinori, which is All Might's real name, is even crazier than you, which is very true if you really think about it. All Might is definitely a crazy person, but the good kind, I guess. And All Might says, if you die again, you rewind back to a kindergartner, right? And All For One's like, he's going to blow himself up. And then in the last panel, we see like an explosion. So I guess that's what happens here. All Might still had one last support item left, and it was on his arm. And it was the gauntlet, which I suppose is meant to represent Bakugo, because of All Might's other support items were from the students of Class 1A, and he pretty much went through everyone except Bakugo, of course, and now the final one is Bakugo's explosion gauntlet, and it looks like he's taking himself out along with All For One. And what makes me think he's taking himself out here is because the Vestige Ghost is disappearing. And the Vestige Ghost was always a weird thing. I guess it was supposed to represent that All Might had like one foot in the grave, or there was just a part of him, or it could have meant that there was just a full part of him left in the quirk factor from when he passed it on to Izuku. And considering that he was still alive, he wasn't like a full-blown ghost the way that the other users of One For All are. It's also interesting that Bakugo interacted with that ghost as Bakugo was dying. So I think that's going to come full circle here, and I think All Might sacrificing himself to put the final nail in All For One's coffin, along with using Bakugo's inspired move here, is going to lead to All Might talking to Bakugo in like the spiritual realm, or the quirk spiritual realm, or whatever. And I guess that will be his final moment with him. It'll kind of be like the end of Fast and Furious 7, where it will be All Might dying as he is passing Bakugo, who is coming back to life. And I guess it'll be kind of like All Might himself being the final thing that brings Bakugo back to life after Edgeshot repairing his heart. I think that would be cool. And then All Might will be a full-blown vestige at that point inside of Izuku, and then we'll see him interact with the other vestiges along with Izuku, of course. And then maybe the full power of One For All is unlocked or something like that, because All Might is like fully in there now or something, maybe. Why not? Because I think that once All For One becomes a kindergartner, after getting severely damaged by this explosion, he'll be so weak that, well, mentally weak, I suppose, not quirk-wise weak, but he won't be able to do anything to Shigaraki, and I think Shigaraki will be the one that absorbs him, and then just absorbs his quirk factor, and then just completely destroys the entity of All For One, like his consciousness, his soul, or whatever. He just destroys it, and he's gone, and now Shigaraki remains with the full power of All For One, and now he faces off against Izuku with the full power of One For All. And then this is like the final battle, and I'm really looking forward to it.
So Bakugo has finally returned in this chapter after being dead for like over a year in real time. But like in story time, I don't know, it was like 10 minutes or something. But we got to this point because we thought that All Might was going to die as well. Because in the previous chapter, we saw that he was trying to self-destruct his gauntlet support item inspired by Bakugo, taking himself and All For One out. And coming into this chapter, we even see like this death, post-life dream sequence thing, that we see from time to time. And it's All Might walking down like this stone road. And he says, one of the things I've done the most is looking back at the path I took, because every single step looked so important and the steps are all glowing. And this is significant for multiple reasons, and we'll talk about it towards the end of the video because that's when it's going to come back. But this sequence cuts off because All Might isn't dead. All For One was actually able to stop the gauntlet from self-destructing by stabbing it with his rivet quirk.
And I'll give him some credit. All for One does know that, as he says, wounded heroes are always the scariest. I know that very well. So I don't expect him to fully drop his guard here. I mean, makes sense. Then he takes some of All Might's blood and licks it using Stain's blood curdle quirk that he got before he seemingly killed Stain a couple chapters back. And now that All Might is completely out of commission, All for One starts focusing on UA again since they're, so close to it. And he realizes that it's begun floating again because it was falling before, but we saw that Gentle was able to use his quirk awakening, I guess, to keep it afloat. And he's been doing that for like a long time. And he was going to let it go, but now that All for One's free, he like shoots a lightning energy beam through it or something. And this is devastating. Like, surely some people would have been killed by this because he says UA absorbed the energy, so I missed the target. And it's like, all right. But this is just restarting the ticking clock that UA falling presented in the first place. And I also think it will probably come down to Izuku having to like lift UA himself or just stop it from falling. Like, I think that might be one of his final feats of power, like just straight up like overhead pressing UA as a whole, and then I don't know, like putting it somewhere else or whatever. But and I say that because I recently watched the movie Sky High. If you guys haven't seen it, you should check it out. It's like a fun little, Disney Channel type movie. But wow, a lot of parallels to My Hero Academia, like so many that I think I might one day make a video essay about it. And I have to also add Avatar: The Last Airbender in there because I think those, aside from Marvel Comics, are like the two biggest inspirations on Horikoshi developing this series. But anyway, Star and Stripes X-66 pilot buddies come back, the Americans, and this is great. It's like, oh, they're gonna help, and they were pretty formidable before when they were with Star and Stripe taking on Shigaraki / All for One pseudo persona, whatever was going on at that time. I mean, most of the success came from Star and Stripe, of course, because her quirk was unbelievable, and she almost straight up, quickly and cleanly killed Shigaraki, but unfortunately, Horikoshi realized that he had made a mistake and took her out, just as All for One is taking out the X-66 pilots here. I mean, wow. It is one swipe of his hand and they are all destroyed. I mean, not like exploding, like you see their wings coming off, so I guess this means that the pilots are surviving this. But that was super anticlimactic. Like, what's even the point of bringing them in here? I guess to just show that, like, hey, they were around for a little bit, but now they're just useless. They helped Izuku, but now their purpose is done, so just get them out of here. And speaking of Izuku, we see him still in a stalemate with Shigaraki, and he's just watching what All for One is about to do to All Might, along with the rest of the world, because this is being broadcast, of course, by the students at UA, and there's like a helicopter from a news station. I think the helicopter's still around. Maybe it was destroyed. I don't really remember. But at the minimum, it's being recorded by the students, because we straight up see them struggling to continue to film in this chapter. The one with the Karen Emperor looking haircut. And as All for One is about to straight up pull All Might apart at the waist. Like, we even see his stomach ripping a little bit. Like, this is pretty gruesome. And I was thinking, like, wow, this might actually line up with Night Eye's prophecy, because he did say that it would be gruesome. But no, it is not time for that yet. It might not ever be the time for All Might to die, because Bakugo is back. He is the last person who is able to save All Might at this point, and he makes a spectacularly brightly shining entrance emanating from UA. And we see him a little drowsy looking, but he still has the clusters around him. And we see that Izuku notices him, and Bakugo also notices Izuku. And before I go into the final sequence of this chapter, let me bring you up to speed on how Bakugo died in the first place, and why he is very likely to be ultra powerful right now. Like, so powerful that he can probably defeat All for One. I know that sounds crazy, but let me explain his new quirk awakening, I guess you could say, that he unlocked before he died, or ultimate ability, his quirk ultimate, whatever you want to call it. So as Bakugo was fighting against All for One / Shigaraki at UA, like before Izuku showed up, in the final moments of that fight, Bakugo was using his cluster ability by like firing off little beads of sweat from his palms and making like multiple explosions from it. However, he was going so hard against Shigaraki that he kept saving up the sweat in the glands in his palms, but it was putting like way too much of a burden on them. So those sweat beads that he kept building up spread throughout his body, and started exiting from other sweat glands. And this caused him to essentially create his own version of Izuku's full cowling of One For All. Because think about it, you have all of these little micro explosions coming from the sweat glands in your body. So you're being propelled at all times. To a, of course, superhuman extent. I mean, Bakugo was already superhuman, just even without his quirk. But now that he has this cluster upgrade, his ultimate, his quirk awakening, he can now finally move the way that he's always wanted to, which is essentially like using One For All at 60%. I don't know how strong he is in comparison to the percentages, but in the previous war, I think Bakugo said that he was like strong enough to keep up with like 40% of One For All or something. Somewhere around there. I forget the exact percentage. Please let me know in the comments. Haven't read that chapter in like 2 years, but I would say given how strong Bakugo is now with his cluster upgrade, and given that we are in the last 20 or so chapters of the series, I'm going to say that he is gotta be like between 60 to 80% of the power of One For All. Strictly from a mobility standpoint. Obviously not talking about the quirks and the punching power, all that stuff. That's nonsense. We're just talking about mobility here. But as for his power set, aside from the mobility and the micro explosions that he has, in his final moment against Shigaraki, he's firing off this like condensed explosion that is just straight up like a energy beam. So I guess he can do that stuff now. Like his explosions are essentially just ki blasts. I mean, they're not, but you know what I'm talking about. Which is a good upgrade, because if we're looking at Bakugo as a whole and who he was always supposed to become, I think this is extremely fitting. And if I was writing his character personally, I would have him have the same outcome as well. Just be super fast, super agile, and then just have like energy projectiles or some kind of other projectile from your palms. I think it's the perfect move set for the type of character that Bakugo is. I mean, don't get me wrong, he always kind of had that on a smaller scale, but I'm talking about like on a One For All, you know, typical manga superhero Dragon Ball Z adjacent type abilities. But after this new ultimate of Bakugo was revealed, he put it on display and he like straight up speed blitzed Shigaraki, dodged his strikes. It was ultra impressive. Like even like the heroes watching it were shocked. But it was very short-lived, because as he went to go after Shigaraki again, he just immediately goes into a dream sequence, post-life, whatever thing, you know, similar to what we were talking about with All Might in the beginning. And it's Bakugo looking at All Might's vestige ghost. And he says that he always wanted All Might to autograph his All Might card that he got with Izuku at the same time when they were kids. It was like a big moment in their lives. And we're going to talk about that again, of course. But as we came back to the present at that point, Bakugo was getting pierced through the chest by Shigaraki, and he was dead. Like literally he was done. And after a crazy sequence of events and a few chapters, long story short, Best Jeanist does his best to sew up Bakugo's heart with some dirty denim. But then Edgeshot uses his own ultimate quirk to spaghettify himself and uses these thin strands to pass through one of Wash's bubbles to sterilize himself. This actually happened, I'm not joking. And then fed himself into Bakugo's heart and then repaired the damage, along with damage to his lungs, with his own body. You know, taking himself out in the process, of course, and fully healing Bakugo, and also, as it says, aiding cardiopulmonary function. And then after that, I'm pretty sure we didn't see Bakugo until this chapter. So it's like, what fully brought him back? Was it just once Edgeshot was finished with his procedure, he just came back? I don't think that's the case. I'm thinking it was All Might's vestige ghost that gave the spark for Bakugo to come back. Because in the previous chapter, when Izuku thinks that All Might is about to die against All For One, the narration says that the One For All vestige within Izuku Midoriya signaled its departure slightly in advance, and it just disappears. And Izuku freaks out, rightfully so. And we thought that that meant that All Might was dying, but I don't think that's what it meant. I think it now meant that it was like leaving the quirk factor of One For All, and then somehow, through space and time, transferring itself to Bakugo, and then using whatever kind of crazy supernatural quirk abilities to revive him. And one way to explain this, I guess, is that if the Two Heroes movie is fully canon, and I mean like everything in that movie canon, then Bakugo at one point technically did have One For All. So I guess the residual quirkiness that was left in him had enough of a signal for All Might's vestige to latch onto. But back to this chapter, because Bakugo is not only just standing there in a cool pose, but he also has that All Might card. The very same All Might card that we saw in that death sequence, also on the ground next to Bakugo's dead body. But we also see like a revised flashback / dream sequence that ties into the beginning with All Might walking down that stone road, you know, saying that every single step looks so important. But now instead of Bakugo and Izuku holding those cards, they're holding All Might's steps. Which of course means that All Might doesn't need to take the rest of his precious steps because he's giving it to the next generation. Which also of course ties into the title of the chapter, the end of an era and the beginning. So I think this ultimately is leading to Bakugo successfully saving All Might, meaning that All Might might straight up not die, which is great because, you know, this whole time we were like, when's it gonna happen? When's it gonna happen? It has to happen, right? Because Night Eye's prediction, but Izuku broke Night Eye's prediction before, and if anybody else can do that, it's certainly Bakugo. And this will also finally complete Bakugo's character arc, I think, because Bakugo feels as though he is responsible for All Might being powerless in the first place. You know, since back in the 3rd season, it was the League of Villains who kidnapped Bakugo and tried to forcefully recruit him, which led to All Might trying to save him, only to wind up fighting All for One in that big epic battle with the United States of Smash, which ultimately took the rest of All Might's power. And because All Might was doing it to save Bakugo, Bakugo felt responsible. So now if Bakugo can come back and save All Might from being killed, that would be massive. But not only that, I think he's also going to defeat All for One as well. Like, I'm thinking that Bakugo is going to, of course, pick up where All Might left off, because All Might said that if he was going to hit All for One with that gauntlet explosion, he would have essentially regressed back to like a toddler with his rewind because of the stress that it would have taken to heal himself with multiple quirks. So I'm thinking Bakugo is going to do this. He's going to do some Kamehameha or something, or just like a 20-piece speed rush combo and revert All for One back to like a toddler, like a 5-year-old or something. And then I think that's when Shigaraki finishes him for good. So this chapter opens up with Bakugo finally coming back to life, but also witnessing the near death of All Might, because we see All for One is about to straight up rip him in half. And this is coinciding with Night Eye's grim future of All Might. You know, something we've been talking about for like 5 years now, where he said you will encounter another villain, and what awaits you then is an unspeakably gruesome death. Like, he told this to All Might. I guess it's like 7 years ago in story at this point. It's like 6 or 7 years ago when he fought All for One and like turned him into a potato. You know, the greatest fight in history that Horikoshi will never show us, unfortunately. But it's like this was what all of that was leading to. The moment where All for One has All Might held up and about to rip him in half. And this is, in theory, like what Night Eye saw at that moment. Now, I'm not going to try to talk about if Horikoshi always had this planned out exactly. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But I do like that Night Eye says you will encounter another villain. Because in that instance, it's implying he's obviously not talking about All for One, since he had just fought him. So I just thought, oh, it's going to be Shigaraki. But no, it's just a young version of All for One. So I guess you could just say that Night Eye saw this, but he saw a young All for One and just assumed it was like another villain. Then after this, we start going into the whole "the wind blows" narration in this chapter, which is, I guess, the theme of the chapter. And it's going to be going into all of this wishful thinking, energy prayer stuff. And I'll go more into that. But we got to talk about Bakugo first, because like we said, he's finally come back to life, and he is not wasting any time. He is just darting straight at Izuku, because they just are able to communicate with eye contact at this point. Bakugo's like, hey, I gotta be the one to go save All Might because Izuku is holding Shigaraki at bay. He's been holding him for like a year now. And Izuku's like, bet, come over here. I can propel you at light speed now. Because as Bakugo is coming towards him, Izuku holds out his left hand while still holding Shigaraki with the black whips in the right hand, grabs Bakugo as he's coming at him, then does like a 360 spin maintaining the momentum. And as they're spinning, Izuku activates Gear Shift on him. This is incredible. Gear Shift is the quirk of the second user of One For All, and it essentially allows you to amplify the speed of things that you touch, typically small things. But given that Gear Shift has been amplified by the overall power of One For All, it has a much more refined and crazy ability, because Izuku can use this to accelerate the speed of his cells. So he, as a person, just goes Super Saiyan. Starts just ignoring inertia, gravity, things like that. And he's doing that to Bakugo here. So Bakugo, already going incredibly fast, using his new awakened cluster explosion quirk, where he can expel the nitroglycerin from his sweat out of all the pores in his body, replicating somewhat of a full cowling effect like Izuku has with One For All. Then on top of that, getting gear shifted and 360 swung by Izuku. This is an amazing sequence. I love it so much. It's like when Horikoshi really wants to go in with his characters, he goes in. I know we've been hot and cold with this series for the last year and a half, but when he wants to cook, he's gonna cook. Horikoshi, that is. In my spoiler video earlier this week, I called him Gege by mistake. That's what I get for recording Jujutsu Kaisen and My Hero spoilers back to back at 2 a.m. But that wasn't me saying one is better than the other, guys. I like them both in their own ways. But as Bakugo is getting propelled to save All Might, Shigaraki is like, he's not gonna make it in time, right? And somehow Shigaraki, knows how the vestiges and One For All works. I mean, technically he was in that world for a second, but not enough to have a full understanding of how it works, even better than the freaking audience. And he's like, the All Might inside of you used to be just a formless silhouette. They don't appear like their true form while they're still alive. But now he started looking like his real self, didn't he? Because we saw that energy ghost of All Might, taking his place inside of the quirk factor of One For All with the rest of the vestiges. That's because, I guess it's implied that a part of All Might is within the quirk factor of One For All, right? I guess it was explained that way. All of the users have a part of their quote-unquote, I guess, soul in it or whatever. That's not straight up said, but I guess it's implied. We actually see that energy ghost of All Might start to dissipate next to the second user as he was warning Izuku to not use gear shift. Because he's like, the kickback from it will be stronger than ever. Because he's already used it before, and the second user already told me he'll only have 15 minutes left. It's taken such an extreme toll on your body that you just can't maintain this. So now on top of that, he's doing it to Bakugo. So we have multiple ticking clocks going on here. I also really like what Shigaraki says here. He's like, the death of the man who brought dreams to this world will bring reality back. Referring to All Might, of course. And I like the dichotomy that is represented through the generation that All Might fostered. Because they were born into the world that he essentially created. And it's like we have Izuku, the ultimate stan, worships All Might, wants to become the successor, as where Shigaraki completely hates him and thinks that he's essentially like a fascist dictator, which I guess if you were a villain, you would have a pretty good argument saying that All Might was, at least for, anything that doesn't fit his justice. Because as Doflamingo said, but anyway, back to Bakugo coming to save All Might, because as he's approaching him at unfathomable speeds, we see everyone around the world watching on and hoping that All Might isn't killed here, hoping that he's saved. And the narration takes over and it starts describing the onlookers, and it says, within thoughts there is sort of an energy, I believe, that now energy from striving for a certain future, energy from wishing. Can the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil really bring about a hurricane in Texas? So, someone brought it to my attention that this concept in the series was brought up once other time in the series, I think, and it was when Izuku had just become 100% with the assistance of Eri perpetually regenerating him. I think it was only in one panel of that one single page, but I'm not the biggest fan of this type of stuff in these series, but it seems to be, somewhat common in Japanese writing, or at least from what I've seen, thought manifestation. Maybe they're big on that. Maybe their writing and particular things that they create have to do with that concept more often than not, I guess. And it seems from both ends of the spectrum. We have the evil thoughts and the negative thoughts with creating yokais and urban legends. Even in Jujutsu Kaisen, cursed energy comes from negativity, negative energy. But then, we have the other end of the spectrum, and it kind of also parallels to how Goku was able to defeat Boo with the spirit bomb and all that stuff. It's also kind of implied that that's how devil fruits came to be in One Piece. So it's like, hey, it's all good. Go for it, Horikoshi. If you want to have this as an element of your series, I get it. It also, you know, touches something in the reader too. But I just wish that the power creep didn't push the population to just essentially resorting to just praying and nothing else. And also, as the whole thing about here with the flap of the butterfly's wings in Brazil can bring about a hurricane in Texas. Also, shout out to Brazil and Texas. Love both those places. But this is like as far as I know, like the iconic phrasing from the butterfly effect theory, right? Or the butterfly effect concept, whatever you call it. Where like if a butterfly were to flap his wings in a specific way in Brazil, it would cause like a chain of events that would eventually lead to a hurricane happening in Texas. So I don't know, a butterfly flaps its wings one too many times and it like upsets a bee or something. And then the bee flies off and like stings some guy in the neck in Brazil. And then him getting stuck in the neck, I don't know, drives his boat off the river or something. And that causes an accident. And then that accident causes like traffic. And that traffic prevents people from getting to where they were supposed to be at that specific time. And, you know, it just keeps going on and on and on until there's like a hurricane in Texas because of it. And I guess you could say that this is all ultimately leading to Night Eye's vision being changed, because obviously he was supposed to die, but he is not now. I mean, even like the quirk factor of One for All thought he was gonna die. It was like, yeah, let's just pre-upload the full facsimile of All Might in here, you know, because he's gonna die anyway. Let's just get prepared. But no, Bakugo's like, nah, if Izuku can break fate, you know, like he did against Overhaul, then Bakugo can do it too, because he does. And he blasts through All for One so fast, like All for One doesn't even realize it until after the fact, takes his arms off in the process, and saves All Might, and ends the chapter with him saying, "We'll win this!" Really satisfying sequence here. In my spoilers video, I said this is almost like us getting our cake and eating it too. Not exactly. I do appreciate that All Might has survived, so I'll say it's kind of like us getting our cake and, I don't know, smelling it, or maybe tasting the icing. Eating the cake too would be like All Might getting One for All back. But that's just a forgotten hope for me at this point. But I'll gladly take him living. I didn't want to have to experience his death, and I really didn't want to have to talk to you guys about it. Nothing against you, I just didn't want to have to get emotional. But now that All for One has to regenerate from this, of course, I guess it's going to stress him a little bit more, and maybe he will regress in age to the point of where he's like 5 or 6 years old eventually. Maybe not right now, but I think this is leading to Bakugo's final fight. I know I've talked about this before, but it just makes so much sense that it would be Bakugo and Izuku at the end facing off against Shigaraki and All for One. And Bakugo, I guess, beats down All for One enough to where he regresses to a 6-year-old or something, and then Shigaraki takes care of the rest. And then I guess Bakugo and Izuku can fight Shigaraki for a little bit, until, of course, you know, Izuku has to do the final hit to him because he's the MC, of course. But I'm really looking forward to the last 20 chapters or so that we have here in this series. Let me know what you think about it in the comments, and if you liked the video, please give it a like, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.